This is Alex Mikochuk, and this is my video essay on the modern synthesis for the Biology 557 course. Um, and so for the first point, providing my definition of the modern synthesis. Um, so the modern synthesis seems to kind of describe sort of how the theory of evolution, the Darwinian theory of evolution, developed over time. Um, and the role it seemed to play in biology, what the consensus was on the mechanics of the theory, how much the theory explained, what modifications were made to the theory down the line. Um, the other lists off a few critical thinkers, Fisher, Haldane, and Wright is kind of the first trio, he calls it a trinity, that he lists off, which were formative in sort of what he breaks down as the first phase of a two-phase kind of process, the modern synthesis. Uh, in this first phase was kind of narrowing down what exactly Darwinian evolutionary theorists believed, and also refuting or excluding any of the competing theories or arguments, or otherwise fusing them into the theory of Darwinian evolution, finding a way to explain away exceptions or otherwise argue against counter theories. Um, and he kind of used this first phase in the modern synthesis as positive. Like he calls it a positive restriction. So, kind of as the theory is narrowed down into a more specific set of principles, and the way that they're applied is standardized, universalized, there's a consensus reached. He sees this as positive. It kind of allows biologists in general to have a common language, a common approach, set of principles, and finally kind of calcifies this theory as something concrete. This first phase is followed by a sort of slight transition where he mentions the scientific writer Huxley, who kind of describes this first phase of synthesis. He doesn't contribute as much directly to the theory, but he kind of births the concept of calling it a synthesis, of fusing specifically Darwinian evolution and Mendelian genetics, and also arguing against Kellogg's main list of refutations, his triple threat, as they call it, of I think it's orthogenesis, um, and saltation and Lamarckism. Those are the three. Lamarckism is sort of completely refuted in this first phase. Saltation is over time kind of excluded. And orthogenesis, I think at first is sort of acknowledged as kind of a weird aberration, and then over time kind of worked into the theory of evolution. The second phase, though, in the synthesis, where he names off writers like Dobzhansky, Mayer, Simpson, um, Stebbins, Wrench, and a few others. It seems like he views this as a bit more negative. So this second stage, the second phase of the synthesis, um, actually excluded sort of some ideas, turned the first part of the synthesis into a doctrine that then became inflexible and not very open to other ideas. Um, and A lot of emphasis was placed on the supremacy to the point of exclusivity of natural selection as the driving force in adaptations, and sort of not accepting any other reason, any other driving force for evolution for any individual adaptation. And natural selection had to be the be all end all in any given situation, no matter what. Um, and he views this as a much more negative development, a negative restriction, as opposed to the positive restriction of the first phase. Um, a statement of why it was important to biology. I mean, even during the time of this synthesis, it had a pretty significant effect on the way biological research was done. He kind of mentions that the second phase of synthesis that he lists off, some of them, with the exception of Simpson, had not much background in the mathematical side, the mathematical population genetics side of their theories, and they would accept writings from other authors like Wright, sort of on face value, without being able to actually critically analyze or really even understand some of these papers that had been published. Um, and the other points out that on one hand, this did lead to sort of a really productive, really energized discovery and discussion, but on the other hand, it also kind of limited the discussion because some of these things were just sort of accepted as fact, not challenged, um, without kind of the proper analysis that you probably should put on those kind of ideas. And obviously, this would continue to potentially impact biology up until today. I'm not as, up to date on kind of the contemporary stage of where some of these questions are at, but obviously, kind of creating a tendency for, let's say, evolutionary biologists to not fully acknowledge, not fully understand the more math heavy side of population genetics could obviously lead to a problem, kind of a glaring issue, and a blind spot in the field over time that could just potentially snowball over time if if more math literate biologists don't enter the field. Um, and as for, is it an outdated concept in the context of modern biology? And has the genetics revolution and other advances dated the concept? Or is there still importance and meaning in the idea of the modern synthesis? So, no, I do think it still has importance and meaning. I still think that there's obviously going to be, I think with any field of science, as it expands, you kind of reach these points where you need to re-synthesize, refuse your ideas, to incorporate new discoveries that have kind of usually at first are sort of just tacked on, sometimes with kind of shaky understandings or explanations. And usually the theories need to be refined and these elements need to be incorporated in a more satisfactory way over time. I think that that's a continual process. I don't think that ever really stops. It might slow down at some point over time. It might be faster in burgeoning new fields. It might be slower in older fields. But I still think that it's going to be a continual process that never really has an end point. I think, if it's possible to discover something new in the field, then it's possible to also uh, require a new synthesis over time, and the kind of debate and process that happened that was described in the reading.